I was 5 when the Yoggoth came. The man in khaki seated across from me nodded for me to continue. My family was part of a mining collective, worker caste, what you would consider lower middle class. There were about 100 families in the collective, along with some administrative personnel. Not what would be considered a rich target, so everyone was surprised when we were attacked. I took a drink of the water I had been provided and continued. I was too young to realize what was really going on. There was lots of noise, screaming mostly, and explosions. Large figures in this shiny black armor gathered us into groups. One of them dragged my broodmother off. We never saw her again. More and more of us were rounded up, and the Yoggoth began separating us. First they dragged off the adult males, then the females, then the neuters. Finally, only the children were left. We were pushed into a cargo bay by one of their ships and left crying in the dark. I pause. You know, I never saw any of the administrators or their warrior caste. Another sip of water. I continue. It wasn't long before we took off. The gravity was horrible and unrelenting. We were crowded in, shoulder to shoulder, and the heat became intolerable. The younger children were crying. I tried not to, but soon I was too. One of the older boys pounded on a hatch and asked for water. He was drug off and never seen again. Eventually, silence overcame us all. I don't know how long we were kept like that. There was no way to mark the passage of time. I do remember once they threw in some food, but only once. There was no place to relieve ourselves, so we sat in our own filth. The little girl next to me died, and all I could do was sit next to her. I stop for a minute, gathering myself. The man in khaki looks up and says, "Continue." After a long time, what I later learned to be about a month, the ship shook violently, and the gravity went out. We, of course, had no idea what was happening. Shortly, we could hear loud noises and the ship continued to shake. Then the hatch opened and a figure in armor stepped in. We began to weep. But this armor was different. It was a flat green color and the figure was smaller. Then it reached up and removed his helmet. She was the first human I had ever seen. I later learned she was a corporal in the United States Marine Corps. Her name was Clark. She called out something and a group of Marines entered the area as we squeezed back. Soon, a warrior was escorted in and told us, "Children of the worker caste, I am here to tell you that you will not be harmed. You will be moved to the human ship where you will be fed and cared for. The humans have no concept of caste or honor, so you will be treated above your station. Do not rise above yourselves." With that, the humans began moving us to their ship. Those of us who could not walk, they carried. Already a marked change from the Yoggoth, who would have left them to die or killed them outright. The gravity on the human ship was higher than we were used to, but not so oppressive as to keep us from functioning, which was good, as the ship was large, and we had a fair distance to travel to reach the berthing areas. As we entered, we saw many Marines moving equipment from one area to another, as they cleared a space for us to live. We also saw many of those separated by the Yoggoth. We rejoiced, as family units were reunited. We also wept for those who did not return. Days passed. The humans treated us well. They fed us and cared for our injuries. One day, however, trouble broke out. A warrior was beating an adult worker who had refused to give way in the chow line. One of the other caste of humans, what I now know to be a sailor, attempted to intervene. The warrior struck him. Immediately, the Marines responded, and the warrior was beat horribly and dragged off to the brig. We workers were terrified. We knew that we would be punished for witnessing the embarrassment of one of our betters. Corporal Clark saw our fear and asked me about it. When I explained, she merely shook her head and said, "If they know what is good for them, they won't do anything." After that, There was always a Marine guard around the worker areas. Pausing again to order things in my mind, then I continue my story. I knew then that I wanted to be like these humans. I began spending as much time as I could around the Marines. Each day I went to their quarters, where they had a large picture of a fearsome Burr spitting fire, surrounded by words I did not understand painted on the wall. I listened to their stories of fights and glory, and the loss of friends. I watched them exercise and tried to imitate them. I helped with their chores. I was happy. Then the Yoggoth came. It was a large group of ships, at least 10 to the humans 1. They ordered the humans to surrender us or be destroyed. The ship's captain refused. The Yoggoth launched their fighters, and the Marines responded by launching theirs, but they were heavily outnumbered, and I knew they would die. I wanted to weep. Our protectors were about to be swept from the heavens. The man in khaki looks up, showing true interest for the first time. The ship's captain took advantage of this sacrifice and turned his ship to the jump point at the highest speed possible. When the battle raged outside, he carried us to safety. Immediately, before we jumped to human space, the only remaining Marine fighter made it back on board. I did not understand the mood when it landed. The Marines were happy and somber at the same time. They celebrated with the pilot and mourned the dead with the next breath. Even though we fled, they treated the fight as a great victory. It confused me greatly. Later, when the routine order had been restored, I asked one of the Marines I was familiar with about this. He looked at me, sadly, and walked me over to the painting on the wall. Pointing, he said, "This explains it all." When I looked confused, he sighed and said, "You have a warrior caste, right? They are born into it and they fight because they have to, in order to maintain their honor and their place of privilege. If they lost a fight like this, it would be dishonorable to live, so would rather die. Marines aren't a caste. It is a profession, or a calling for some, but we fight because we choose to, not because we have to. We fight to protect our country and our people, not our privilege. We fight to win, and sometimes you win by staying alive to fight another day. We remember our brothers and we fight for them. We are the dogs who guard the sheep from the wolves." He then gestured again at the wall. "These words say, 'rough men standing ready.' It is part of a quote. We sleep easily in our beds, because rough men stand ready to visit violence on those who would do us harm. We are those rough men. Now do you understand?" I could only look down, embarrassed, and nod my head at him. Looking at the man in khaki again, I suppress a little surge of anger at having to recount this story and be judged by him and say, "This is why I wish to enlist, Sergeant. I wish to be one of those rough men."